Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. India went to polls today in a massive seven-phased exercise that will end on May 19th, nearly a month-long process. The counting of votes will be conducted on May 23rd and the results announced the same day for the 17th Lok Sabha, which is the Indian National Assembly and its lower house. The House comprises 543 MPs elected from single-member constituencies by nearly 900 million eligible voters using first-past-the-post system. The main contenders are the Bharatiya Janata Party of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his allies and the Indian National Congress and its allies. The pundits and psephologists are predicting a close fight, but there is a general sense that the BJP will be returned to power, though with 30 to 40 less seats than the current headcount in Lok Sabha. Yet, Indian election results are notoriously difficult to predict, and pundits have previously been proven wrong more than once. Prime Minister Imran Khan in a speech has been reported as saying the talks are more likely if Mr. Modi wins. The statement hasn't amused the Indian National Congress, and some critics have called it a diplomatic faux pas. The statement also comes on the heels of Indian aggression at a much higher rung of the escalation ladder, with Delhi employing its air force to attempt to strike targets inside Pakistan. Also, some days ago, Foreign Minister Shah said in a presser that India was planning to attack between April 16th and 24. To see what lies ahead if the BJP wins, we take a look today at some relevant features in the BJP's manifesto, which the party calls Sankalp Patra, which is the pledge. We are joined by our former finance and foreign minister, Mr. Sartaj Aziz. Mr. Aziz, thank you for joining us. How do you look at the situation? For instance, the BJP is very clear that they want to get rid of Article 370, which gives a special status to Indian-occupied Kashmir, and also Article 35A of the Constitution of India. And they say, and I'm quoting from their manifesto, we are committed to annulling Article 35A of the Constitution of India as the provision is discriminatory against non-permanent residents and women of Jammu and Kashmir. How do you look at this, sir?
Well, this is not new. In their previous manifesto also, they had said we'll consult with all stakeholders how to eliminate 370. And as far as 35A is concerned, it has been in the Supreme Court of India for quite some time. But it's the sensitivity of the issue within Kashmir which is seeking an adjournment, and therefore it has not come forward. 370 they cannot change, in fact, because the deadline by which the Kashmir Assembly had to pass a resolution to annul it has passed long ago. But 35A remains a threat, and the only thing which will deter it is the reaction of the Kashmiri people, because there are very, very strong views on this. So the real issue is not what the BJP puts in the manifesto, but the ground situation in Kashmir, where the agitation and the campaign for gaining the right of self-determination in Kashmir has been gaining momentum, particularly after July 2016, when Burhan Wani Marhum was killed and Shahadat received. It has been a very difficult period for the Kashmiris, but they have stuck to their will and their determination to fight for their rights, and that is what will actually decide the situation in the future, and not what they say in their manifesto.
So, what we have seen what has happened in Kashmir over 5 years, but here in the manifesto, the BJP says, and once again I quote, in the last 5 years, we have made all necessary efforts to ensure peace in Jammu and Kashmir through decisive actions and a firm policy. I believe these are euphemisms for the state oppression in Kashmir, but it seems that despite various analyses and statements coming out of India itself from the BJP opposition, which have criticized, in fact, deeply criticized this policy, the BJP, it seems, at least to the extent of the manifesto, once again for 2019 onwards, that they will continue to follow the same policy because they think that it has given them dividends.
Well, I don't think it has given them dividends. It's a very sad situation that their violation of human rights and the repression has increased manifold in the last few years, so much so that the UN Human Rights Commission has taken note and submitted a very strong report on it. Parliament after parliament in the international level have been condemning this, And so much so now there's a reaction within India against all this. And so my own feeling is that this policy is not going to succeed. In fact, it's a slur on India's name and negates their claim for permanent membership of the Security Council with that kind of a record. So ultimately, I think they have to come to the conclusion that without taking the Kashmiris on board for deciding their future, there's no solution of the Kashmir problem. The only thing that worries me is their efforts to change the demographic composition of Kashmir, bringing Kashmiri Pandits, trying to divide a wedge between the different parts of Kashmir, the three different segments, and also promoting Kashmiriyat and relegating Islam. Now, I think these are steps which they have been taking, but in my view, in fact, the Congress manifesto only talks of reviewing the Special Powers Act and the Disturbed Areas Act of Kashmir, which means softening. So I hope that the voter turnout in this case will prove to BJP that their policy has not been endorsed by the voter, because there are strong predictions that BJP may have simple majority, may not have the simple majority that they had into 2014, and may come with a very reduced number.
There's a general sense that they might fall about 30 to 40 seats short of what they got in 2014. But let me ask you another issue with reference to what they say about the security side of things in their manifesto. And again, I quote, "Our security will be guided by our national security interest only." This is exemplified by the surgical strikes and the airstrikes carried out recently. Now, they're still selling the surgical strikes and, of course, these recent airstrikes. Now, the surgical strikes happened in September 2016 when it was the PMLN government. What exactly was the government thinking? I'm assuming that, the government had a session of the Cabinet Committee on National Security. Was there any sense that Pakistan needs to respond to this, or we just said that since nothing had happened, therefore we don't need to respond? Of course, in reality, we did not respond, but what was the thought process at that time?
Well, I think the briefing that I remember, that there was no real surgical strike, like the LOC violations taking place. This was probably a more violent violation of that particular incident. So there was no so-called surgical strike which deep inside our territory. Otherwise, they would have displayed the footage or the evidence of that, and that's why nobody. And similarly, their new strike has also not been believed. So I think this is, of course, this rhetoric that you referred to is for domestic consumption and test the voters. What worries me in their security doctrine is their emphasis on expanding their defense budget, modernizing their armed forces, accessing very advanced technology in cooperation with USA in terms of modernizing their weapon system. So this is something which has to be taken seriously because unless we have to have sort of take note and be prepared in relation to India's capability to defend ourselves. So that is one. Secondly, on the foreign policy agenda also, they have said India is occupying center stage, and India will now play a major role in deciding the global agenda for the 21st century. So their ambitions are very clear from this, and they're also talking of a global coalition against international terrorism, some kind of a forum they want to create. And so these are diplomatic challenges that we'll have to meet. I hope in this we also include state terrorism that they are exercising within Kashmir and so many other dimensions. So I think while most of the manifesto is geared to the elections, we have to read between the lines and prepare ourselves both for the diplomatic security and the military onslaught that they are planning in their coming tenure if they win the election.
I don't want to belabor the point, but let me go back to the surgical strikes in 2016 once again. Now, nothing much happened on the ground because they did try to ingress at 3 points. They were blocked at 2 points, and at one point they did come in about a kilometer and a half. and fired. It was essentially a fire raid, and then they went back. But the issue was not what had happened. The issue was that they did attempt something. And secondly, given the fact that they were playing on perceptions, and if you go back to what was being said and written at the time, it was all about the new normal. Modi was selling to his constituents the fact that he is the masculine leader and he is going to do something which the Congress government could not do. Now, was there any thought when our side sat down to try and figure this out in terms of a response, was there any thought that a response was important because it wasn't so much about what had happened on the ground, but the fact that the perception needed to be fought?
Well, I think the basic thing is that once you do not accept that something happened, how do you respond? But I think the LOC, of course, remained hard. And the basic fact is that a similar quote-unquote surgical strike, much more dangerous because it came from the air, was done after Pulwama, and we befittingly responded. So I think it depends on your calculations. This time, since they violated our territory very openly, we retaliated and successfully retaliated. So I think in each case, our armed forces have to decide which is the best course to follow to counter their narrative as well as their attacks.
So another thing in the manifesto is about the fact that AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and which is constantly being talked about, and it's a very draconian law. While a lot is being said about AFSPA, and the Congress manifesto says that they will revisit it, I have something written by Gowher Geelani, who's a very prominent Kashmiri journalist based in India. And I'll quote from what he has written. While the Congress promise on the controversial Armed Forces Special Powers Act has triggered a political controversy, there's hardly any debate on the more lethal and frequently misused PSA, which is the Public Safety Act in Jammu and Kashmir. It was enacted by the National Conference in 1978. The People's Democratic Party has not been far behind in its misuse, even against minors, during its rule. The law was brought in as a deterrent against timber smuggling much before militancy reared its head. It finds its roots in the Defence of India Act, a colonial British time legislation. Now, PSA is something which the police and the security forces in Indian occupied Kashmir use to enable them to constantly detain people. And I can give a number of examples which Gowher Geelani gives in his article, where people have spent like 13 or 14 years. Every time the court tries to bail them out, the police slaps another case under the PSA. Why don't we make it a part of our narrative to constantly talk about these things in order for the world to know that Kashmir is under a number of, not just AFSPA, but a number of other draconian laws?
I fully agree with you. I think not just narrative, we should document them regularly, almost on a monthly and quarterly basis, and make them available to the International Human Rights Commission so that their next report not only documents the laws, but the way they have been misapplied and brutally used, because that will further give them a very good basis to criticize that here you talk of being internationally conformist country and call yourself a democratic country, but from Kashmir you have these draconian laws which are being overused against the innocent citizens of that state, and also the manner in which it has gone on despite all the protests. So I think this is something on which we should actually commission very elaborate homework so that these are documented and brought to the international attention.
Okay, so a few days ago, the foreign minister, Shah Qureshi, held a presser in which he said that we had intelligence reports that India is planning an attack on Pakistan, which will be, and he actually gave a time band from April 16th to April 24th. Day before, the Prime Minister made a statement in which he said that if Modi is returned to power, there are more chances of India and Pakistan's engagement. Of course, the Indian National Congress is not amused at all by the statement by the Prime Minister. But what do you make of the Prime Minister's statement versus what the Foreign Minister said?
Well, I think normally such statements are not issued to the press through a press conference. I mean, you inform P5 and your diplomatic contacts that we have this and there should be some restraint. And I think similarly, we should not comment on issues which come in the domain of electorate of another country. Once the election takes place, you can express any hopes. But I think Modi's record in the last 5 years does not lend any strength to this expectation that if BJP comes to power again, he'll start immediately serious negotiations on Kashmir. That they will be forced by the ground situation and the struggle of the Kashmiri people. So let's see when the results come out.
So you're basically saying that the Prime Minister should not have given this statement, which then forces me to ask you what the process is. When the Prime Minister has to make a statement, how does this work? Is the Foreign Minister the person who briefs the Prime Minister, and the Foreign Minister in turn is briefed by the Sherpas at the Foreign Office? How does the process work? Or do the Prime Ministers just play off their own bat?
Well, it depends on the Prime Minister. Some prefer to do it themselves, and some need elaborate briefs before they talk on these issues. So I think in this case, every Prime Minister has developed his own style, and so let's see how our present Prime Minister will evolve his strategy on these issues.
Okay. Final question. If Modi is returned to power and forms the government, even if he falls short of 30 or 40 seats, he's likely to get the allies to make up for that difference. Do you see any chances of positive engagement, or do you think that Modi will continue with the negative engagement policy that he has exercised over the last some years?
Well, it's difficult to say. My own guess is that he may make some gestures to tell the world that, look, I'm ready, but terrorism is a big issue, etc. And also, eventually he wants peace on his terms, which means Pakistan accepting peace on its own terms. And in this case, if you notice in the manifesto, they have talked of regional cooperation through BIMSTEC and cooperation with ASEAN without making any reference to SAARC. So their strategy to isolate Pakistan and not deal with it in terms of economic cooperation remains one of their priorities. And my own feeling is that here again, the whole connectivity of South Asia with Central Asia remains an unfinished business. And the economic opportunities and advantages for both countries, the whole of South Asia, is enormous. So I think here again, friends of India will have to remind them that this policy is not sustainable nor good for India, and therefore SAARC should be activated and regional cooperation and regional connectivity promoted.
Thank you so much. That was Mr. Sartaj Aziz, former Finance and Foreign Minister of Pakistan. We are now joined by Neha Poonia, who is the Indus News correspondent in New Delhi. Neha, thanks for being on the program. So India went to polls today. It's a massive 7-phased exercise that will end on May 19th. It's almost a month-long exercise, and over 900 million voters for 543 seats. What is the sense? The pundits and the psephologists are generally saying that BJP will probably return to power, perhaps 30 or 40 seats less than they got in 2014. But pundits in Indian elections have been proven wrong more than once. So what is your sense?
That's absolutely right, Ejaz. In fact, I'm coming to you live from a position that's just about a stone's throw away from the Indian Parliament. The first step towards electing a new government, putting new members of Parliament in place in that building, were taken today, with the first phase of polling taking place across 20 Indian states, with 140 million Indians casting their ballot. Voting will wrap up in just a few hours from now. And the sense is that it's anyone's guess, honestly, because the states that went to polls today, in those states, like the states of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, it is believed that regional parties hold the sway as of now. Of course, Prime Minister Modi, according to most opinion polls, and a lot of voters that I've spoken to personally as well, he is the most popular leader. But very important to remember that India is not a presidential election. The contest currently is presidential in nature, with Rahul Gandhi taking on Prime Minister Modi. But at the end of the day, it's a parliamentary election, which means you're not electing Mr. Modi or Mr. Gandhi himself. You're electing your local member of parliament, who in turn, if they have majority, will elect a prime minister. So currently it looks like Mr. Modi is in the lead, but there is still 2 months to go for the election process to continue, and 2 months is a very long time in politics.
Absolutely. I think it's very difficult to get a median, because in a parliament election, unlike in a presidential election. But tell me, there's now a lot of controversy with reference to AFSPA and Article 370 and 35A, especially after what Congress said. As far as the BJP manifesto is concerned, they basically say, and I quote from the manifesto, "In the last 5 years, we've made all necessary efforts to ensure peace in Jammu and Kashmir through decisive actions and a firm policy." Now, decisive action and a firm policy seem to be euphemisms for a lot of use of force and oppression, and also flies in the face of many analyses and statements coming out of India itself over the last 3-4 years about how the center was mishandling Kashmir. There's also what they say about, "We reiterate our position since the time of the Jan Sangh to the abrogation of Article 370, and then they go on to say, "We are committed to annulling Article 35A of the Constitution of India," and it goes on. Now, we know that 35A is in the Indian Supreme Court, the petitions, and they have been adjourned. So that is sub judice. But what is the sense across about the abrogation of 370 and the annulment of 35A? And I'm not talking about the state of Jammu and Kashmir, because we know what the situation there is.
Exactly. I was going to tell you just that. I mean, it honestly depends on which part of the country you go to and who you speak to in those parts of the country. Most followers of the BJP, most supporters of the BJP agree with their ideology. They do believe that removal of both of those articles, 370 and 35A, is the step forward in order to ensure normalization, quote unquote, in Jammu and Kashmir. They say that that's the way to ensure that Jammu and Kashmir residents mingle with other Indian citizens from other parts of the country. Of course, that is vociferously sort of objected to by members of the local parties in Jammu and Kashmir, as well as residents of the state. They say this article was put in place for a reason, because Jammu and Kashmir is a sensitive state. It needs these kind of constitutional protections, provisions in place to ensure that the sort of current scheme of things, they don't become worse in the days ahead. But there are critics, of course, who've said this is not the way forward. This is not the kind of Kashmiriyat that Mr. Vajpayee spoke of, that Mr. Modi said he would implement in the beginning of his tenure. So there's been a marked change in that kind of approach to Kashmir. A lot of critics say that Mr. Modi's mishandled that situation. We've seen a lot of protests in Jammu and Kashmir in the last 5 years. The government has been completely sort of forthright in admitting they're using a muscular policy. Even in a lot of the rallies that Mr. Modi has held, along with other members of his Bharatiya Janata Party, they've said that their stance on tackling terrorism, which they think is something that is a problem in only 2 districts of Kashmir, is something that they've handled by giving forces a free rein. So the BJP, in a sense, not really moving from its position. Yes, they mentioned this in 2014 as well. Like they said, they've moved forward on this particular proposal, but like you said, it's pending in the Supreme Court. We don't quite know what will happen, obviously, because it all depends on who comes to power, what's the kind of majority. If the BJP does win another tenure, what's the kind of majority they'll have, whether or not they will have the might to introduce any kind of amendments in Parliament, because we saw in this tenure they had majority in Lok Sabha, but they had no majority in the upper house, that's the Rajya Sabha, which is why a lot of the bills that they wanted to change to reflect their ideology was stalled by the opposition.
Okay, interestingly, and of course predictably, the BJP manifesto begins with the security issues. And it says our security doctrine will be guided by our national security interest only. This is exemplified by the surgical strikes and strikes carried out recently. Now, I want to know, does this still sell? I mean, the surgical strikes or the so-called surgical strikes, nothing much happened on the ground. And as far as the airstrikes are concerned, we've seen what happened. So does this sell? And I'm not saying does it sell with the BJP constituents. I'm saying does or would it sell with the floating vote?
That's where the sort of narrative really matters, Ejaz. What you're speaking to is also considered to be Pakistan's version of things. The Indian government has come out time and again. Last week, you had the Indian Air Force also hold another press conference where they showed proof of shooting down an F-16 that Pakistan allegedly used. So, I mean, we know where both sides stand as far as the government and the militaries are concerned, but that's a very important question you've asked in terms of what the voter feels about this entire narrative. Since that attack in February, where you had 40 Indian security personnel martyred, since those airstrikes that followed, this has been Prime Minister Modi's essential election pitch. He has been going to rally after rally, telling Indian voters, I am your protector. I can keep India safe from any kind of aggression that comes from Pakistan's side. He's even quoted the Balakot strike, as it's called in the Indian media, at a rally that took place just a few days ago, and that was something that was massively criticized by members of the opposition who were saying that this is politicization of the armed forces. They are not your army, Mr. Modi. They say they are India's army. Of course, the Indian government, in this case Mr. Modi's government, ruled by the Bharatiya Janata Party, say that while we were in power, we took those steps. The opposition, that's the Congress, when they were in power for 10 years, they never retaliated to quote-unquote Pakistan's aggression. So a lot of the voters I'm speaking to, Ejaz, tell me that what happened in terms of the narrative that the government is telling them about matters to them. They say national security is very important, which is why it's remarkable that 2 months down the line, this issue is still the most important issue. The manifesto that you're referring to also has a line right in the beginning, before they list out that 14-point security agenda. It's under Mr. Rajnath Singh, the Home Minister's address, where it says, before we can do anything else in the country, we need to keep India safe. So clearly for the BJP, this is the only issue that matters right now. A lot of voters say, yes, unemployment is a problem, agrarian distress is a problem, but we need to give Mr. Modi another tenure. I mean, that's the only way he'll fix it. I'm not just talking about traditional BJP voters. The majority sentiment seems to be those airstrikes were something that the BJP did good on.
Absolutely, because and the reason I asked this question was because in terms of job creation, employment, in terms of demonetization, which has been criticized by some of the best economic minds in India, it seems that if Mr. Modi is still returned, perhaps the voters are looking more at security than some of the other stuff. But on security, the thing is that it seems, and I'm not voicing what the Indian opposition has said, but it does seem that the Indian Air Force, partly for its own reasons of prestige, and partly, for reasons of perhaps being politicized, I can't say, seem to have, and I'm referring to the press conference that you talked about, seem to have put out a narrative which is not by any stretch of the imagination credible in the sense of having a final say on whether the Indian Air Force shot down an F-16, because on the ground we found that Wing Commander Abhinandan's aircraft had its air-to-air missiles and other armaments unreleased. So nonetheless, it seems that there is a certain kind of nexus between at least the IAF and Mr. Modi's interests at this point in time. Would you agree with that sense?
I think, Ejaz, it's a very serious allegation to make because the Indian armed forces, be it the military, be it the Air Force, they've always been very, very independent. In fact, when a senior leader of the BJP came out and said that the army is Mr. Modi's army, a lot of people in the forces said that that's an unfortunate comment to make. We don't work for anyone. We're not sort of soldiers of one army. And speaking of the Indian Air Force press conference that took place, as far as the Indian Air Force is concerned, they have shown radar images that clearly show an F-16 that was involved in the combat, and they're saying that Captain Abhirandan shot that F-16 down in POK, which is why Pakistan occupied Kashmir. That's what India calls it. And they're saying that's why that radar image shows an F-16 a few minutes before, and 10 minutes later there's no F-16 on that radar frame. They also say they have other evidence which they cannot put out into the public domain because of security reasons. So the Indian Air Force has been very steadfast on its allegations. Whether or not what Mr. Modi is saying, that's secondary. The Indian Air Force has been making these comments quite independent of the Indian government. So that's an allegation that the Indian Air Force and the government would reject. And to quite an extent, the Congress has not been questioning the Indian Air Force. The opposition has not been questioning the armed forces. They've been questioning how Mr. Modi is using this as an election pitch at a time when this sort of poll is so crucial for him and his party.
Okay, the reason I asked this question was because there have been previous instances where from within India, former military officers have criticized the fact that there have been serving military officers that have participated on political platforms of certain right-wing elements. So that is one of the reasons. Secondly, just a technical point with reference to the radar images. Static radar images do not mean anything. Unless the Indian Air Force can present moving radar images where you can see certain dots disappearing, and of course they can also disappear, again a technical point, disappear for various reasons, because in a mountainous terrain there can be, the radars sometimes do not pick up an image for a split of a second or more than that. But that's a technical point. But thank you so much, Neha, for being with and giving us your sense of what's happening on the ground. We're going to take a short break. And when we return from the break, we will continue with our discussion of Indian BJP and Congress manifestos. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of Indian elections and looking at the BJP's manifesto. And I'm now joined by Dr. Sikander Shah, who is an international law expert and teaches international law at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and also Gowher Geelani, who is a journalist based in Srinagar. Sikander, if I might, this whole business of Article 370 and Article 35A, is it just a domestic issue, or are there any international law ramifications of this?
Oh, there are definitely international law ramifications, and the ramifications relate to both the Kashmiris as well as to Pakistan. From a Pakistani perspective, when this whole issue, this dispute came about, you had a UN resolution, UN Resolution 39, which led to the formation of a UN commission, which worked in tandem with another UN resolution that talked about plebiscite. So I raised this because when the UN Commission report came out in relation to the plebiscite, they made it very clear that you cannot change the demographics of Kashmir. No one can come in. Citizens of Kashmir they can return, but you cannot depopulate Kashmir.
So 35A is even more crucial compared to 370,
right?
Which is more of the Indian internal issue,
right?
35A then directly gets connected to the resolution.
It gets connected to the resolution and other. I mean, I'll talk about because the international law has evolved and changed, but at every single point in time, if you look at, for example, if you move forward and you move towards the Shimla Agreement, which is a bilateral arrangement, even there, it's clear in the Shimla resolution that you cannot, if you want, I can sort of read out it because it's important. Pending the final settlement, neither side shall unilaterally alter the situation, and both shall prevent the organization, assistance, or encouragement of any acts detrimental to the maintenance of peace and harmonious relations. So I think, I mean, I'm talking from a Pakistani perspective right now. I'll come to the Kashmiri perspective. But from a Pakistani perspective, both these resolutions, both these actions, 370 or 35A, would change the status quo in one way or the other, legal and actually practically speaking. And India's been doing this for a while, in the sense in the last 10 or 15 years, they passed a certain bill which talked about maps showing Kashmir, even within Kashmir. In India, they talked about settlements of armed cantonments in that region. So from an international perspective, from a Pakistani perspective, this is a violation of the status quo. And from a Kashmiri perspective, it's even bigger, because the resolutions I just mentioned, apart from that, you have international law on this. Kashmir is an occupied territory. And when it comes to an occupied territory, any settlements coming from outside by an occupying power are war crimes. I mean, this has been stated in the 4th Geneva Convention. It's been stated in the Additional Protocol 1, which is sort of a newer document. Then it's been in the Rome Statute, the ICC statute, it's been clearly outlined that it is a serious war crime, and so on and so forth. So
in theory, 35A petitions are now pending at the Indian Supreme Court. There were supposed to be hearings on 26 Feb to 28 Feb, but then the occupied Kashmir administration asked for an adjournment, so it stands adjourned for now. But in theory, if the Indian Supreme Court were to decide that 35A is annulled, I'm just putting out a theoretical point of view, and it is annulled, does that then allow us as one of the parties and the Kashmiris as another party to pray to the International Court of Justice or to the UNGA or to the UNSC? What could be the remedy? Right.
I mean, I think we could the resolutions on Kashmir can be reinforced. We can go to the Human Rights Council. We can take it to the Security Council. ICJ is a tricky issue because there's an issue of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction. But I think that there are other forums. I want to talk about other violations as well here, because this is closely linked to ethnic cleansing. If you basically try to change the demographics, the international, there are certain bodies that have come out and said this is a form of ethnic cleansing. I mean, if it leads to that, right? And in that regard, also the International Criminal Court on Rwanda has talked about attacks against a whole population, which includes deportation and transfer of populations. And that's considered to be, not all attacks against the population have to be use of force. It could be about changing demographics. And they've actually called it a crime against humanity.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Let me go to Gowher Geelani. Gowher Geelani, in democracies, electoral exercise is generally a good time because people exercise their right to vote. They can throw out the previous government and they can, bring in new people. But it seems to me, from what I hear and read, that occupied Kashmir, this exercise is another exercise in oppression with people unable to move. They are checked at every point. They are stamped on their palms or whatever. So what's going on the ground?
Well, Mr. Ejaz, I first wanted to go back to this debate over Article 35A, because, I just wrote a piece for the Defense Post, the US-based, organization, specifically on Article 370 and 35A. 35A basically is, it allows Jammu and Kashmir legislature to define the permanent residents, who are the permanent residents of, disputed Jammu and Kashmir. And it basically has roots in a law which was there when the Hindu Dogra rule under Maharaja Hari Singh was there, and it is like from 1927, 1928. So this was then adopted by the Jammu and Kashmir has a separate constitution. And as far as the Article 370 is concerned, that basically defines the relationship between Srinagar and Delhi, the contentious and much talked about temporary accession with the Union of India. So these are very important as far as the somebody before me spoke, and he talked about the altering the status quo. And this has happened, why there are anxieties in Kashmir is because the same thing happened in Jammu province in 1947 after the Poonch rebellion. And there was this massive migration, and 237,000 Muslims were killed, and the Muslim majority character of Jammu province was changed into a Hindu majority region. So these are the fears right now, not of the JKLF or the Hurriyat conference, but these are the fears of the common man. And also the unionist politicians who are pro-India, pro-Delhi politicians. For example, if you take Mehbooba Mufti, she's the former chief minister, and she says if Article 370 and Article 35A is annulled, as the BJP claims in its manifesto, then the entire relationship between Srinagar and Delhi comes into question, and then it depends on the Jammu and Kashmir people of Jammu and Kashmir and the politicians, their leadership there, to redefine the relationship between Srinagar and Delhi, and whether people want to have that kind of a relationship with Delhi. So this is now the resistance narrative has been adopted by the unionist politicians as well. So as far as the BJP manifesto goes, why they have included annulling Article 35A and 370. It's nothing new. This has been there since the 90s. All the manifestos of BJP post Babri Masjid demolition have included two things. And there's a repetition of those things. One is reconstructing Ram Mandir, and second is annulling 370. So it's all as I see, it's a posturing. It's all winning the second term. But coming specifically to your question, which you asked about this exercise happening in Jammu and Kashmir, recently a law was passed which was a replica, which was a reminder of what happened in Poland in the 1930s when Nazi Germany, they passed a similar law against the Jews in Poland during the German occupation of Poland. So similarly, this similar law was passed in Jammu and Kashmir, wherein residents of Jammu and Kashmir cannot ply their vehicles on the national highway, the only link that connects Jammu and Kashmir with the rest of world. So this link you are not allowed on Wednesdays and Sundays. Even if it's an emergency, it doesn't matter. And they have put some magistrates on the streets who, as you rightly pointed out, they stamp you on your palm and God knows where. So this is the kind of, situation that is there on the ground. And today there have been allegations that a senior BSF commander, a border security force commander, has actually influenced voters of the Gujar community in Poonch region, Jammu region, wherein he has asked them to vote for the BJP. That has been tweeted also by the former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti. So things are very, very bad. It's kind of a very precarious situation wherein there is a total demographic and existential threat that is being felt by the people on the ground.
So Gowher Geelani, tell me some more about, there's the AFSPA controversy, Armed Forces Special Powers Act. But earlier in the program, I read out something written by Ejaz Geelani, which talks about the Public Safety Act as a more draconian law. Do you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not only Ejaz Geelani. If you today read Asian Age, there is a very famous and very senior Indian journalist, Bharat Bhushan, who has written about how, this Modi's muscular policy and all these claims that, BJP has been tough on the national security. Then he questions that there have been spectacular attacks in Uri, in Pathankot, and in, the recent one in Pulwama. So it says it's all hollow claims by the BJP because it has nothing to sell. The Vikas, which when translated into English means development. So he has no developmental agenda. The unemployment is on the rise. GST has been a disaster. Rahul Gandhi calls it Gabbar Singh tax, GST. So, as far as the Public Safety Act is concerned, as you rightly pointed out, it was there in place when Sheikh Abdullah was the chief minister, and it was used against timber smugglers. And now this draconian law is being used against political dissidents. For example, there is an example of Masarat Alam, who has been slapped with over 50 PSAs. Even, common people. I met a young boy in South Kashmir's Anantnag district. His name was Atif. And his only, he has been slapped. There are more than 50 FIRs registered against him. And the man is not a militant. He doesn't throw stones. he just has a political view that Kashmir has to be resolved. So, he has been constantly harassed, his family has been harassed, and he's now referred to as a jailbird. So that is the kind of, violation that these laws have been violated time and again. And especially as far as the AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act is concerned, there was a notification issued by the then governor, because to have AFSPA in any part of, in any state, you have to declare that state as a disturbed area. So there's an act called Disturbed Area Act. So from there, it's the AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, is in place in Jammu and Kashmir since 90s. So now it's been 30 years. And for 30 years, on the one hand, BJP claims we have this muscular policy and we have brought things under control. And on the other hand, they also justify the use of draconian, AFSPA and PSA. And as you know that, Yasin Malik, JKLF chief, has been slapped with PSA. All other Mirwais has been called thrice and interrogated by the National Investigating Agency of India. So there are these laws are actually used against anyone in Kashmir who has an opinion, who is a pro-resolution, who just talks about peaceful resolution of Kashmir dispute.
But Gowher Geelani, it seems to me that the BJP basically, for all the state oppression and everything, and also criticism from within India and by international bodies, stands with what it has been doing in occupied Kashmir. And I quote from their manifesto: in the last 5 years, we have made all necessary efforts to ensure peace in Jammu and Kashmir through decisive actions and a firm policy. Decisive actions and a firm policy. Euphemisms for naked oppression, state oppression.
Absolutely. You see, Mr. Ejaz, as far as there is this Operation All Out, which was supposed to be against the gun-wielding armed rebels. But this Operation All Out seems to be against anyone holding an opinion in Jammu and Kashmir. There have been, as far as the Greater Kashmir and other newspapers, very popular newspapers, English newspapers and Urdu newspapers like Uzma, their government advertisements have been not curtailed, but also altogether stopped. So there's an assault on the media, there's an assault on the freedom of press, there is an assault on the political resistance leadership, there is an assault on the, everyone who wants a resolution.
There's an assault on basically all democratic values, even as India goes to polls, which is the deepest irony. Thank you so much, Gowher Geelani, for giving us your insights. I have to wrap the program also, Sikander, but given all this, what are our options?
I mean, I've said this before as well, that, we cannot acquiesce into what's happening here. We have to raise these at the right forums. I mean, I think we've talked about this, that if you don't raise these things, then they become the norm and they can actually be accepted under international law. So you have to raise every single violation.
Which Sartaj Sahab was saying, that we need to record everything.
Yeah, we need to record everything. We need to go to the right forums in the UN and the other bodies. India has signed a number of international human rights treaties like ICSID, which is on racial discrimination, which have come out and said that forcible transfers of populations or changing the demographics is ethnic cleansing. So we need to have our legal team in place, and we need to raise it at the right forums. And internally, we have to also create awareness within government.
What legal team? That legal team has to be at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
There as well as...
Or is it just the law ministry?
I think you raised the right point, your apt point when you talked about even the Prime Minister. I heard the Prime Minister talk about, when he was talking about the BJP issue, the Modi winning the elections, that would be good for Pakistan and resolution. He also talked about controlling militants in Pakistan, which could cross over. And, you as a Prime Minister of Pakistan, you shouldn't be saying that, because that's, again, accepting that they are militants.
Precisely accepting the narrative. That's right. The whole, I've been, constantly saying this, but somehow no one seems to listen.
That's why they need legal teams advising the Prime Minister, advising the...
So as a lawyer, I'm sorry, I'm pressing these points because I have to wrap up the program. Is language something important? Every comma, every subclause, every full stop that you put there, does it mean something, or is it just something that you can, whatever comes to your mind, you can say that?
It is very, very important. Even if you look at maps, like the LOC map, there's going to be annexure there saying that this is disputed territory, you cannot change the status quo, and we need to be raising that at every single forum, whether it's a map, whether it's something happening internally in India, and also all the legal words we use. If you want to talk about militants, that's a word. Freedom fighter is another word. Occupation is another word.
Counterterrorism is another word.
Right.
Insurgency is another word. Administered means something else. Held means something else. Occupied means something else. So basically what you're saying as a legal expert is that we have to take the language very, very seriously and the taxonomy very, very seriously. Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Sikander Shah, for talking to us. This is all for today from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.